Now, for more on the gains and missed opportunities at the just concluded U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, I'm joined by Daniel Kawuma. He is the National Unity Platform Leader, USA, and a native of Uganda. Daniel, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, you're very welcome. You participated in this Leaders Summit. You know, the diaspora was very, very engaged in it.
Absolutely.
But what were the main takeaways for the continent of Africa?
The main takeaways is that the United States wants to re-engage with Africa after several years where China has been dominating the scene on the continent. We have seen bilateral trade between the Africa continent and China rise to 35% from 2008 to 2021, while that of the US had declined from about 140 billion US dollars to 61 billion US dollars. So the United States had to re-engage with Africa, and this summit offered an opportunity for them to reach out to African countries as partners, as equal partners, at least that's what the rhetoric says, so they can re-engage in the continent of Africa. And we want the United States to re-engage in Africa because for us who are human rights advocates, you want to stand on the sides of the United States the way we see Ukraine. They are standing up with Ukraine. We had President Zelensky yesterday in Washington, D.C. United States is a key ally for us who advocate for rights of African people, and them re-engaging with the continent is crucial. And Biden's commitment of $55 billion was a big takeaway from that summit. But also what we don't want to forget is that human rights are still a priority. Though United States wants to compete with China on the continent, they should not forget that they're the shining city on the hill, and they need to hold our leaders accountable on the continent.
Well, 49 presidents of Africa, that's quite a number. But what would you say were probably some of the missed opportunities that these leaders were not able to tap into from this summit?
There are several missed opportunities. In the grand scheme of things, the AU should have presented an agenda at the summit, which they did not do. All the African countries came with individual agendas, and that creates chaos for the continent because we had this opportunity to challenge the United States to make Africa a priority, but we did not do it as a team, as a bloc. So each country lobbied on its own. Uganda lobbied on its own, and others lobbied on its own. That was a big miss at this summit. As well as the lack of priority on human rights, in my opinion. Most of the human rights organizations were on the sidelines of the summit. Yes, there was some little engagement, but the United States should not go on the low side to attract African countries to the United States. They need to continue prioritizing their value, which is democracy, human rights for Africans, and individual liberties.
I like what you say, because President Biden did tell the African leaders, be careful what you ask for. He said they want him to go to visit all the countries.
Absolutely.
But he's going to be watching that part in particular, human rights and all of that. But tell us about the Biden administration's offer to the diaspora. There's going to be a lot of engagement that was seen previously in other administrations.
Right. The Biden administration has done a great job of engaging the African diaspora. There's a new council through an executive order, which will be the Presidential Advisory Committee for African Diaspora Engagement, that is going to work through the State Department to engage the African diaspora. So that's a big win for us in the diaspora to engage, to have a seat at the table. Secondly, the United States government is also going to invest $100 million in YALI, which is the Youth African Leaders Initiative, and that's going to be a big win as well for the young future generation of Uganda, because the youth are the leaders of tomorrow. Also, the Biden administration is making commitment to support Africa to get a seat on the Security Council at the UN. That's a big win, as well as to be part of the G20. Those are key achievements which we think the African continent can seize on.
So you mentioned Uganda. Did you get a sense that the Ugandan government got to agree on certain issues during this summit in terms of trade, investment between the U.S. and Kampala?
That's an excellent question. As a Ugandan, I was very concerned about our presentation at the summit. We have a leader who has been in power for 36 years, a very unpopular figure on the continent. And as time has gone on, we have seen what's happening on the streets of Uganda. There's abduction of civilians, there's human rights violations. And so when he came to DC, he failed to advocate for the bulk of our population. Average age of Ugandans is 17 years old. So what we want are initiatives that are going to mobilize that base, create job opportunities for those young people so that they do not flock to embassies to get
look,
visas.
Daniel, why do you say that? There is a room called the deal room. And
right.
This is where the presidents of Africa and the U.S. officials, the private sector, were making deals.
Right.
Want to tell me there was nothing that Uganda put on the table?
They're advertising a deal for an oil refinery for Uganda, which was $4 billion US. But that deal was signed in 2018. That's what they're saying is their signature achievement. There were a couple other deals as far as inviting investors to Uganda and opening up trade channels. But the priority for Uganda at the moment should have been tapping into the resources the Biden administration is offering, particularly for young people, for renewable energy, especially the green economy. That's the future of our continent. And as Uganda being in the Sun Belt, that was a very missed opportunity for our country not to prioritize our young people, not to prioritize the opportunities we need today. And instead, they were marketing, in fact, some of the businesses which they brought to the United States to open markets for. One was for the son-in-law of the president, which also signals what's happening in Uganda, where we have the wife of the president as the Minister of Education,
so
the son as the
because we're
general.
running out of time. Tell
Yes.
me, why did Ugandans hold protests in D.C.?
We protested for a number of reasons. First was the human rights violations that are happening in the continent of Africa, especially in Uganda. We are seeing abductions of civilians on the streets of Uganda today who are part of the opposition. Secondly, free and fair elections. 54 Ugandans were shot on the streets in the recent elections. There hasn't been any accountability. And the third is equal justice under the law.
What about the other parts of Africa? You mentioned that you are protesting because there are other violations going on there, and very briefly.
Yes, we see the situation going on in Egypt with President Sisi. There are many political prisoners in Egypt. We see what's going on in South Sudan as well. When we are marching, we are with people from South Sudan, people from Egypt, people from Sierra Leone. So the human rights violations are happening across the continent, and this should be a priority of the United States as we move forward. So they don't only focus on the economic sides of things, so they can also focus on the human rights violations happening, especially in Uganda.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for your perspective.
Thank you very much.